So welcome everyone to the graduate gardener class. It's a class meant for people who have, maybe gotten their hands in for a season or two and want to get a little bit deeper into the ground and figure out ways they can really maximize their plots or their home gardens. Make sure you guys get our new green guide that we just came out with this year. Our new green guide, it does have information about the gardens, where they are, information about how you can get connected through the Summit Garden Network. I also have my cards on the way out. If you guys want to get something like that, you can email me with any questions. Also contacting Jen and going on to the Summit Garden Network website. We're going to talk about, maximizing your plot. We'll talk a little bit about pest management, biodiversity, how to get the most out of what you're working with, time management. We'll touch on season extension and just general high altitude stuff. I do have a background in gardening. I went to school in Vermont for agro and for education, so this is sort of a nice combination for me, being able to hang out with you guys and do this stuff. I've worked at several different farms, including a fossil fuel-free CSA, a vineyard in northern Italy. Worked at several different educational farms. I've worked with oxen, horses, worked all over New England, and been working a little bit out here, getting used to the altitude. So it's been a lot of fun and an educational experience for me being out here. I've had about 5 years of professional experiences with farms that sell, and they're able to survive that way. And it's a lot more fun when you're in a plot and you don't have the pressure of making money on it. So guys, enjoy that part. So topics that I want to talk about a little bit today. Succession planting. That's basically how you're going to get the most bang for your buck. We've got a short season, so you really want to bump your crops right next to each other so you're never in an empty spot. We'll talk about companion planting. So those are the plants that get along the best with each other. Those are the plants that like to be next to each other, because there are some plants that don't like to be next to each other, and there are some plants that actually can benefit those that are right next door. So we'll talk a little bit about who are the best friends. We'll talk about a little about heirloom varieties. Those are more rare cultivars that are really nice to preserve biodiversity and keep different varieties that are really close to culture, keep them from becoming extinct. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about trellising. This is a great way to max out your home garden and to max out your plot is by going up. And you can go up with a lot more than you think you can. So it's pretty fun to talk about trellising. And then we'll talk about resources. We've got some great resources for all gardeners, new or experienced. And then we'll have a question and answer section at the end, the last half hour. So if you want to stay, you can. If you don't, that's totally fine, but it's going to be a time where we can all share our experiences together. So if you have any questions as we're going along, thoughts, comments, shout it out, raise your hand, whatever you feel like doing. Anything so far before we get started? So succession planting. There's a couple different ways of succession planting. The easiest way to get started if you've never created a garden calendar is just by getting a little paper calendar or using a Google Calendar to start to plan your garden. This is going to help you visualize when you want stuff to come out of the ground, when you're going to be harvesting, and lets you work backwards. Because you're going to start with your harvest date. So I'm going to pass around some seeds. This is going to be the basis of your calendar, this information that's on the back of the seed packets. And you guys have all seen seed packets, and that information sometimes on the back gets thrown to the wayside, but it's really important. Having that information as well as your frost dates allows you to get the most out of the small season that we have. Jen, Santry, and me and Kyla and Kyle, who run our CSA, we usually run around Father's Day for our planting time. That's usually when you're safe. Not a guarantee up here, but it's a usual.
And that's mostly for plants, right?
Yeah.
Like transplants.
Yeah, so transplants, getting them in around Father's Day. And that can be helped with a little bit of season extension, things like putting plastic over top, that sort of thing. But so you want to plan backwards, like I said. So you start by picking out plants that you really want. Whether you're ambitiously looking at tomatoes or you're sticking with more cold crops like, you know, potatoes, broccoli stuff, anything like that, you want to start with when you're getting them out of the ground and then work backwards, making sure that it stays within your frost dates. Write everything in pencil at first because you're going to change things around a lot. You're going to need the information about spacing. You're going to want to make sure that you're not overplanting things. And this will allow you to plant 2 or more crops, one after another, sometimes different varieties, sometimes the same varieties. And this is going to require a little tweaking as you go too, from season to season. You know, your first season you try out your planting calendar and it works great, but you know, you really want to push up the carrots a little bit more. You know, you make those adjustments and you'll eventually have a really good resource that you've created for yourself and your own little microclimate. Because Breck is going to grow different from Frisco. Frisco is going to grow a little different from Silverthorne. Not a ton, but they are still little microclimates, and they're different depending on what plants you want in there. You also want to know which plants to transplant, which plants like to be direct seeded, so having the seeds put directly in the ground. A lot of times you can find that on the back of the seed packet. Sometimes you have to do a little research. And once you find what they like, you then need to take that into your plan as well. So to have those transplants ready to go, germinated with their little leaves out and ready to go into the world by the time that you want to get them into the ground. This allows you to not have any of those blank spots and just, you know, be able to pump stuff out but not be overwhelmed either. You know, you don't want all your lettuce at once. You want maybe one section planted a couple weeks before the next section, planted in a couple weeks before the next section. So that way you can have lettuce all summer long, as opposed to way more lettuce than you would ever want all at once. And that can apply to a lot of different vegetables. And that can apply to peas, that can apply to green beans, anything like that. So calendar, working backwards, start with the harvest date. Yeah.
What are our frost dates, or how do you find these out?
So finding your frost date, it works with the zone. We're either zone 4 or zone 5. 5 is Breck, 4 is Frisco. Most of them are more towards the 5 side.
Backwards.
Frisco's 5 and Breck's 4.
3, 4,
3, 4.
5. So it's going to be lower for the corner.
Yeah. So 3, 4, and 5 are our zones. And Father's Day is right around when we found is the last frost date of the season, so you can get those transplants into the ground. Seeds are still a little bit too sensitive to get in there. Maybe how far along?
Well, I actually think that you can get seeds in sooner, because if you're growing, sorry, I'm like talking to her.
Talk to everyone, Jen.
So this is what this is sort of a discussion, because you know Cassidy might have different ideas of growing than I do. And then you probably, if you went to Susie Knopfnagel's class, she might have talked to you about transplants versus seeds. And a lot of people love to like get into garden season early as possible, and they'll start all their seeds inside, and then they go outside and put everything into the soil, and they get super bummed because they all die. It's really hard to transplant here, and if it's before Father's Day, they have really cold nights, and they're just fighting these extreme temperatures, and it's really hard on them, besides the sun, besides the fact that we have crazy wind and all of that. So I think seeds can get started a little earlier outside, because for one, if it's too cold, they're not going to germinate, and they're just going to hibernate until they're ready to sprout. And I would say most of the stuff that's like your greens and your cold-loving crops, if you put them in early, they're going to totally be fine, and they're going to get used to our extreme temperatures. And most often, I've found they sprout up, and they'll catch up with the stuff you grew inside. If not, outcompete with that. They'll do better. So
Yeah, and if you are doing transplants and you're starting them at home as opposed to buying them at the farmer's market, you want to do a process called hardening off, where you take them outside for a little bit of time, and once a day, bring them outside if you know it's going to be a warm day. That way they can get used to a little bit of wind. That way they can get used to a little bit of conditions, so it's not as much of a shock for them to go from inside climate, perfectly comfortable little happy bubble, to outside being like, oh my god, it's rain and sun and wind and I don't know what to do. So having that little transfer time too, the week before you're putting them out to transplant, hardening off, bringing them out for a little bit at a time, once every other day or once every day, depending on how often you're at home. something like that. Does anyone have any questions about succession planting before we continue on to the next one?
Can you maybe do like an example of?
I certainly
Go.
can. The next
Okay.
slide is an example. So this is actually really, really small. So I have a handout. I don't have too many of them though, so if you guys want to just take a peek at them and share. The calendar that I'm handing out is from Kyle and Kyla. Those are our local CSA farmers. This is an example of their planting calendar that they use in the greenhouse. So don't base anything that you guys are doing outside on a greenhouse one. This is mostly just to show you how they color code things. It basically just lays out a map of your summer of, you know, what day you're going to be doing what and who's going to be doing it, and if you're going to be putting your first round of kohlrabi in, or you're going to be pruning your second round of beets, and that just sort of is your hand guide for the summer that you create for yourself. This is another example. This is not a local one, but it does a good job of laying things out all on one page. It has all the varieties right here, and then it has listed by month each of these columns, not that you can see it too well from back there, each of the months through the summer, and then the little blocks are growing times, or when they're going to be harvesting, or when they're going to be cultivating. The red blocks are going to be their harvest times. So you can lay it out on one page. You can do it on a Google Docs like that. You can do it on a little paper calendar your bank sent you. It's really easy to do once you get into it, and once you figure out what you want, how it reacts for the area, and you're able to make tweaks. And the more tweaks that you make and the more seasons that you use it, the easier it's going to be and the more accurate it'll be for whatever you want to grow and where you want to grow it. Does anyone have any questions about the example?
Well, either of the examples, how do you figure out how often to plant something? So this has carrots, it looks like every 10 days. I mean, is it dependent on the crop? I mean, or on the...
It's dependent on the crop. It's dependent on how much of it you want, how much space you have, and how long it takes to mature. So it is a lot of different factors, so that's why you gotta write it in pencil first, because you're probably gonna change it a lot. But if you really wanna grow carrots, and you want carrots all summer long, you're gonna start with the last harvest date that you wanna get in at the end of the season, and you're gonna work backwards from there. So that way you're harvesting carrots on a weekly basis, or harvesting carrots on a 2-weekly basis, and then the quantity of carrots that you would want in that time based on how many seeds you wanna put in. And that's how you're gonna create that, you know, every 10-day carrots, or every 20-day carrots, or something like that. Depends on how much you want of each thing.
Do you want to do an example of those, maybe?
Yeah, sure. So if I've got squash and I want to work with this, it has a maturity of 60 days, so I'll work backwards. If I want to harvest at, you know, mid-September, then I've got to work 60 days back from that. That's when it will have germinated. So maybe I want to do them transplanted. So that germination date, 60 days before, is when I would want on my calendar the day that I'm bringing them outside. So I'd have that written down on my calendar. And, you know, 5 to 10 days before, I would have them started in my house. I'd have that started on my calendar. So my start date, my transplant date, and my harvest date. And then, you know, if you really like the calendar thing, you can throw in, you know, I want to weed on this day, I want to water on that day, you know, just to make sure that you are in a habit of being there at certain times, being there on a regular schedule. Does that make sense, or am I?
On this Kyle and Kyla's one, like they're showing this week, they've already planted cilantro, kale, cucumbers, carrots.
Mm-hmm.
Is that seeds or transplants?
It's a mix, and they're in greenhouses.
Yeah, so this is in greenhouses. That's why I said you don't want to base it on that.
Yeah.
It's just an example of how they're working with the calendar.
I was like, hopefully.
Yeah, I wanted their outdoor one so we could actually use that as a starting point, but their outdoor one isn't available yet.
So like another example for what you were just showing would be radishes that usually mature in 30 days. So then you would plan on your calendar however days it takes for them to germinate, then plus the 30 days for them to mature, and you would count backwards just like Cassie's talking about, and then you would kind of count backwards enough to where you say, okay, maybe I can get 3 crops of radishes if I plan them accordingly. Then that's how you're doing succession gardening.
Yeah, do you find any difference, like the seed package says it, harvest in 60 days? Does that actually apply up here, or does it tend to take a little bit longer?
Yeah.
It definitely, yeah.
It takes a little bit longer. It depends on the climate. It depends on where you're growing them. It depends on the soil. If they have less nutrients to work with, they're going to grow a lot slower. So, I mean, that's a guideline,
Okay.
but it certainly
I
isn't.
figured that was like under perfect growing conditions, which obviously you don't.
Yeah, it's more of an average. It's not
Okay.
ideal, perfect, but it does take into account a little bit of, here and there issues. It's a good place to start with, though. If you start with that, and then you can make tweaks and you can say, oh, well, this variety took actually another 10 days, so it threw me off a little bit, but now I know that for the next season. And so it is sort of a constantly adjusting thing and something that you want to keep up with, so that way it'll eventually be your perfect hand guide, but it won't by any means be perfect on your first try if you're working with just seed packets. And there are a lot of resources out there to be able to build your own succession planting calendar, a lot of resources online, and then resources in this room and other people who are planting here, more experienced gardeners that have planted, maybe in your plot in previous years, and you can ask them, you can ask your neighbor plot holder if they've been doing it for a couple years, see what they've experienced there, or people who have been growing in the area, in the microclimate for several seasons, and see what has affected what. And again, those season extenders like plastic, and then like what Jen was saying, the water walls. So these are like small little, they're almost like little squishy tube things that you fill up with water. They go around the tomato plant individually, and they serve as an insulator. They heat up during the day, and then the water retains that heat throughout the night. So it's almost like a tiny little mini greenhouse for that one tomato plant. So that's able to help them go along. Mulches are a great way of retaining heat and moisture in your soil. That's something to consider. The High Country Compost Facility does do mulch. So if you're interested in mulching, it's another good season extender. Any other thoughts about succession planting? We're going to talk about companion planting next. Okay. So companion planting, these are the best friends forever. These are the plants that help each other grow, that are able to get the most out of your plants by putting something good and something next to them that will be able to help them grow the most and just boost their production. So the first one that I have on there, first of all, there's hundreds of different relationships. These are some of the most popular ones. Some of them have more scientific background than others. Some of them are just sort of hearsay, old wives' tales, but some of them actually do have a really good background. So give them lots of tries. Make sure you don't just trust what you're reading, cross-reference things if you want to try something new. A really good oldie is the Three Sisters. That's this picture right here. Corns, beans, and squash. This was a Native American staple. Basically, the corn serves as a trellis for the beans, and the beans fix nitrogen from the air for the squash and the corn. So it's a really good symbiotic relationship. The corn is gaining from everybody, the beans are gaining from everyone, the squash is gaining from everyone. And it's a nice way of trellising without trellising. You just have to make sure that you have them timed right, and that's again back to the succession planting. You don't want your corn to be this big when your beans are this big. So you have to look at that harvest time, how long it takes for them to mature, because you want your corn to be a little bit bigger than your beans. You don't want your squash to overrun your corn. So it does have to go in a little bit of an order. Corn, then beans, then squash, pretty much, but with certain timing in between. Another really good one, horseradish and potatoes, or horseradish and pretty much anything. Any of those like really spicy things like radishes, horseradishes, spicy herbs like mustards, those kinds of things are a really good deterrent for pests. They're really good for deterring bugs, slugs, anything sort of airborne, moths, those kinds of things. They don't like the spicy stuff. So if you put a spicy thing next to a thing you want to protect, a lot of times that will help with pests, and you don't have to use a pesticide or traps or anything like that. And potatoes are really sensitive to viruses. They're sensitive to the potato beetles, and a lot of times that spicy stuff can help with it. Horseradish in particular helps other plants with disease resistance. So horseradish is something nice to put in with other plants, whether or not you actually like horseradish. It might just be nice for the other plants. Carrots and tomatoes. You see this book, Carrots Love Tomatoes. They love them so much that they're the title of the book. The carrots actually don't benefit from this relationship. They've got the short end of the stick, but the tomatoes do. There isn't a ton of scientific background on it, but this was one of my studies when I was in school. Tomatoes usually increase production by around 20% when they've got carrots next to them. Carrots, they don't do so hot. They usually end up getting like really tiny, but they keep the tomatoes really happy. So the book says it, I say it, God believe us. Radishes and lettuce. Again, radishes, that's that spicy thing. Lettuce gets eaten by everybody. Everybody loves lettuce. But even sometimes deer too, it can help repel. If they accidentally take a bite of the radish instead of the lettuce, they go, "Wah," and they don't come back as often. Maybe in a perfect world, but sometimes it helps. Beans and eggplant. Beans are awesome. Beans and clovers, anything in that family fixes nitrogen from the air. We have tons of nitrogen in the air, but getting it into the soil is the challenge. You can get it into the soil with compost, you can get it into the soil with decomposing materials, or with any of those legumes. So white clover is a great ground cover. It keeps your weeds from growing, but it also fixes nitrogen. Any sort of beans, green beans, lima beans, any of the beans, help fix nitrogen as well. So things like eggplants, anything in that family that needs a lot of nitrogen, tomatoes included, benefit by having those guys around. So this is my recommended book if you want a nice list of companions, who goes with who really doesn't like who, and how to get them close together. Work that into your succession planting calendar. Think about, maybe drawing out a map of your plot and what's it going to look like in this week, what's it going to look like in that week, to make sure that you have buddies next to each other and make sure that you have enemies apart from each other. There aren't too many enemies out there, so you don't have to worry about too many of them, but you're able to get a lot more out of your garden if you're able to get the buddies next to each other. That was a nice picture of how you can get lots of friends near each other.
Strawberries and onions. Is that correct? Strawberries and onions.
Yep, strawberries and onions is another good one. Those onions, those bitter tasting things, a lot of times if you put those next to the really tasties, that helps a lot, whether it's with pests or whether it's with disease. Those two generalities seem to go with each other quite a bit. Any questions on companion planting? We've got another slide on it after this, so we're not totally off the topic, but any thoughts as we're going along?
You mentioned white clover. Where do you get that?
White clover is just a ground cover. You can get it in most seed catalogs. It's just under ground covers. There's usually a different couple kinds of clover, a white clover, a green clover, and they usually don't grow any higher than this. And if I'm using white clover to surround something, I will just throw it onto whatever your plot or your home garden is, and push it into the ground. You don't have to dig it all up and cover it or anything like that. They're really hardy. Feels good on the feet if you like walking through your garden. You don't have to walk on the ground. You can walk on a nice bed of clover. Any other questions about clover or anything like that? Ground covers? Okay. So the next one, and I'm hoping that this isn't it's really small. But if you want to write down this link, this is a really great chart. I use this all the time. It has a list of many, many, many vegetables in this direction and in that direction. Every dot is a best friend. So that's a really nice way of saying, okay, well, I want to use this, this, and this, make circles around who you're planting, and then see who matches up. See if you can make new relationships. They also have a couple good ideas about pests and how you're able to use companion planting to keep pests away. So after companion planting, we've got heirloom varieties. I'm a really big advocate for planting heirloom varieties. So for those who have not worked with or experienced heirloom varieties, they're any sort of cultivar. So cultivar, a group of plants that have been selected for particular traits that they have. They're usually an open pollinator, but basically they've not been industrialized. They're the like weird looking tomatoes that you see at the farmer's market and you're like, why does that look like an ugly old guy who's turned purple? That's the heirloom tomato. They're non-GMO, so they're not genetically modified. They're non-hybridized. They haven't been crossed with any other breeds of whatever it is that they could be crossed with. They haven't been genetically engineered to have a terminator gene. A terminator gene has been patented by Monsanto in the past year. Basically, after the first year, any seeds that it produces, they just won't work. They don't have any endoplasm. So that's a really scary thing, because if that gets out into nature, then we'll have lots of plants that won't reproduce on their own. Really scary, but we'll talk about politics and stuff in a little bit. So yeah, they've been preserved by families, they've been preserved by communities. Cultures all over the world have their own really cool heirloom varieties of everything. You know, there are purple carrots, there are yellow pear tomatoes, there are all sorts of lettuces, way more than you could ever find in a grocery store. You know, purple sunflowers right there in the middle. All these are gourds, all those are green beans. You know, what a fun way to get the kids to, eat their green beans. Well, how about if they look like they came out of Dr. Seuss? You know, heirlooms are so cool. They can be saved from year to year on your own. Because they're open pollinators, they might not breed true year to year all the time, but most of the time you can get good seeds from a good batch of whether it is tomatoes, carrots, blah, blah, blah. We are going to be doing a seed saving workshop this fall. So keep an eye out for that for folks who are interested in saving seeds. But you can also get heirloom seeds in a couple specialized seed companies at farmers markets. My recommendation is Johnny's Seeds is a really great site to get organic and heirloom seeds. They're a really good company. They're really responsible for their employees. So that's my recommendation. You can also get clover there. For ground covers. And it's really important that we keep these varieties alive because no one else will. You gotta be the one that, you grab onto that thing, and if you save a seed from year to year, if you start off with a particular tomato that you're able to get to grow up here and successfully, save that seed, because each generation is gonna make it more able to survive in our environment and a lot more vital. It's going to be doing well more each season that you use the seed over and over again. And you can create your own heirlooms that way. If you use it for 5 seasons and you find that it really works well in Frisco, well, it'll be the Frisco big boy tomato or whatever you want to call it. It's a great way of individualizing your garden that way. And biodiversity, so having a variety of green beans, tomatoes, beets, whatever it is so important, because when you don't have biodiversity, if everything is the same, whether it's an industrial corn farm or a big soy farm, it means they can all die the same. It can just be one bug that they're susceptible to or one storm that they're susceptible to, and it can all be wiped out. And if we're able to keep these biodiversity sorry, I've got a cough today. If we're able to keep this biodiversity going, and if we're able to keep all these different varieties going, we're able to make sure that, okay, well, this kind of gourd didn't do so well up here, but this gourd did. Because having those different kind of personalities, different kinds of plants, means that we can keep our food going. So a quick little political side note. Monsanto is a very big genetically modified goober out there. They got permission to patent DNA. And this is very scary because it means that if I am a Monsanto farmer and I've got genetically modified corn and my corn open pollinates and my pollen goes over to Jen Santry's beautiful little farm, and she's got some corn there, and I find out that her corn is hybridized with mine, I can sue her. And I can cut her off at the legs pretty much. And they've been doing that, and it's really, really scary. So that's another reason why biodiversity is super, super important. But don't want to go too far off into the political field. Does anyone have any questions about heirloom varieties?
What are some heirloom varieties that grow well up here?
Some heirloom
You could
varieties
stereotype.
that grow well up here. There's a bunch of different ones that do well in a drier climate. I don't know any on the top of my head. That's Johnny's Seeds, the one that I recommended. If you go on there, they have a huge catalog. No joke, it's like that big if you actually order the catalog. But they've got big descriptions of each of their heirloom seeds, where they do well, why they do well in this, where they are, any recommendations that they have will be right there in the catalog. They're a really great resource.
And also I have to give a shout out to our local nurseries too, because I know that Summit Landscaping and Sherry at Alpine Gardens has also some heirloom varieties. So they're the real resources on what can grow really well here. So I would go check them out. And then I also know too that there's a tomato guy, Gary Ibsen, I think his name is. He has like a ridiculous amount of tomatoes online. I don't know if he's called a tomato guy. I can send the link out or post it on our website. But we have found tomatoes for the Living Classroom greenhouse that are less than 60 days to mature, and they're all like great high altitude. So he has like several types, like Alaskan something or other, and one from Russia and Siberian this and that. And it's just awesome to know that there's tomatoes out there that's already in existence that we can maybe improve for our climate.
And those resources too that Jen just mentioned, they're good for questions too. If you're there buying something, make sure you ask them, well, tell me about this. When should I be putting it in? Do you have any recommendations? They're really, really knowledgeable, so don't hesitate to ask them questions.
And Cassidy's correct too. Everybody's so used to like the butter. I'm trying to think of all the names of like your greens, like your iceberg lettuce. There's like hundreds of kinds, and
Doing a big mescaline mix is so
Yeah.
good with mustards in it. You
Go
can get all
big.
sorts of flavors, and there's so much variety out there. You might be someone who doesn't like tomatoes, but you might find that you really like, the Little Sister beefcake, whatever. There's so many different kinds, so many different flavors, textures, shapes, looks. It's really cool.
And radishes, like the purple radishes or the daikon radishes. There's so many different tastes and kinds. And if you do try to like have that variety even in your plot, then if you didn't succeed with like some stuff, you're not at a loss because you have so many other things that are doing well. So I think we should still try for a seed swap maybe.
Yeah, that would be
If
cool.
people are buying a bunch of seeds, then you only need a couple of those.
Yeah, and so biodiversity at work, even in your own plots. If you, plant a row of beets, see if you can get, a mixed seed packet of beets, which you can get through Johnny's, and so you can try a couple different kinds of beets and have a rainbow of beets, and the yellow beet might do better than the red beet for you, and you're able to try it out and test things, and heirlooms are a great way of doing that. So any other questions about heirlooms? Get really excited about heirlooms. So a little bit about trellising. So trellising, a great way to go up. You only have so much dirt, but you have some plants that like to go up, and so you might as well take advantage of that. But it's really more than just a space saver. It's an easy way to monitor and control pests. If all of your plants are up and hiked up, then you can see what's going on in between all the leaves, in between all the stems. It's a great way of picking things off or being able to see where the issues are coming from. All that air going through the plant makes it a lot healthier. It's not going to get damp and moldy as much. It's a great way to improve your harvesting experience. If it's up as opposed to down here, you're not going to be breaking your back trying to pick things up. It's also a great way of finding all of your harvestable fruits. If you're looking for sugar snap peas and you're having to like lift this plant up and look underneath, then you might not find as many as if it was all up and organized. So I highly recommend trellising everything you possibly can. There are plants that do like to be trellised, some that don't. you know, pole bean versus a bush bean. Pole bean likes to come up here, bush bean likes to stay down there. No need to trellis a bush bean. And then certain kinds of plants need certain kind of trellising based on the weight of whatever plant you're making, you know, the kinds of fruits that it's producing. You don't want it to, you know, start listing to the side if it's too heavy. As a general rule, any sort of climbing plants with fruits that are smaller than a volleyball, general idea, it means that it's trellisable. So this would include tomatoes, peas, and any of those are kind of obvious, but cucumbers love to be trellised. Those are a good trellisable thing because their leaves get so big too. That's a nice way of actually being able to find the cucumbers. So I highly recommend that. Whole beans. And then there are also some funny ones too, like gourds, melons, squashes, even small pumpkins you can trellis if you've got a sturdy enough trellis. Depending on where you're trellising, you're going to need different materials, whether it's your community garden plot, home garden, you know, depends on how much infrastructure you can put in. So if you want to do something big in your community garden plot, I recommend asking Jen Santry first.
This one here, so that's what I was talking about for neighbors. If you have a half a plot, everybody was doing well with throwing it down the middle at both the gardens. It's kind of like your dividing line, and then you guys grow up on both sides, and then it's very supportive. So that did so successfully last year.
Good way to share, and good way too if some plants like shade. It's a great way of producing shade. Make sure if you have a lot of plants that don't like shade, make sure that your trellis is on the north side of your garden, so that way you're not shading anyone who does not like to be shaded.
The good thing here, just a note on that too, is we don't have that problem in our gardens because the sun is so high in the summertime. I was worried about the shading. That's why we kind of tiered the ones at the living classroom. Did anybody see any problems with shading in their gardens last year? It was just sunny all the time.
Hey, you guys are pretty exposed in most places, so it shouldn't be
I do
an
know
issue.
that the living or the greenhouse can help shade in a positive way, just kind of filtered light. It can get really hot on the end if you're near the road. I know Dee, was it really hot for you?
It helped, I think, having that shade in the late afternoon.
Okay, some shade.
Yeah, so I mean, you can get creative. You can see this one's made with some crutches. This was at one of the farms I was working at. We decided to play around with that. You want to make sure that whatever you're using, whether it's sticks or bamboo, it all needs to be sunk fairly deep into the ground unless you're doing something really big like that, because you don't want it to fall over. It is a nightmare when trellising falls over with a bunch of plants on it and you're trying not to squish anything or step on anything and get it back in. So not something that you want to be dealing with, falling over stuff. Make sure you use materials that are happy with plants. Things like the baling twine around hay, that stuff is made so it's pretty toxic and it can actually burn plants that it comes in contact with. So make sure that you use stuff that isn't going to be harmful to your plants. Any questions about trellising?
What is that one in the upper right-hand corner?
This is more of like a shade divide kind of thing. This is an example if you're going to be doing stuff at home and you have plants that prefer shade or prefer a cooler climate. This is a great way of creating shade, whether it's for your home or whether it's for any sort of landscaping.
So there's trees?
No, these are, it's poles going across, and this is actually a grapevine right there, and then these are trees in between. That's a very artful. A funny trellising story, we were trellising melons a couple of years ago at one of the farms I was working at. The melons got too big, so what did we do? We put them in bras. So you can get creative as you go.
Pantyhose, I've seen pantyhose.
Yes, old bras, not new ones, that's too expensive. Any questions about trellising? Okay, so going on to our resources. We've got a lot of really great resources for you guys. The Summit County Community Garden Network, if you Google search that, or if you, what's the website?
SummitGardenNetwork.org.
SummitGardenNetwork.org. They also have a Facebook page, Twitter page, so great ways to stay in touch with other gardeners, great ways to see what events are coming up, classes, ways that you guys can get together and share information with each other. Just the High Country Conservation Center website is pretty good, but we also have a lending library I have a couple books out and around with everyone. Those came from our local lending library. Pop into our office Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And we have lots of gardening books in there that you guys can borrow for free. Check out your library, check out online. As far as shopping, Johnny's Seeds is what I've recommended before, and we can maybe do a link online or something to him. And he ships, and everything's pretty reasonably priced. He's got a lot of good stuff in there. Even like the last page this year is all about pests and stuff like that. You've got these big blow up eyeballs that like deter crows and stuff like that. Books. Tomatoes love tomatoes, that they do, but also carrots love tomatoes. And if I had my brain on when I was writing this, I would have written that. Seed to Seed is my recommendation for people getting into seed saving. It's a big book. Sometimes it can be a little expensive, but totally worth it. It has every vegetable in there and how to save its seeds. I mean, even like lettuce, how to save lettuce seed. And that's a little bit of a process. So it's a really good book, really great the way they lay everything out. Book Trellising, how to grow climbing vegetables, fruits, flowers, vines, and trees. You can trellis trees. I don't know why you'd want to. But vines, anything like that, that has a really good section about materials, ways of building. It has designs in there as well. Vertical Gardening is a good one. That's another trellising book. And then these are our next upcoming classes that are directed at you guys gardeners. Practical Beekeeping, Growing a Better Vegetable Garden, The Eccentric Barefoot Gardener, which is a wonderful title that our lovely Jen Santry came up with. Backyard Chicken Basics, and a lot more all throughout the summer, and especially in the fall too. We'll have lots of workshops like this, and we'll have workshops in CMC. We'll have some culinary-based ones at the end of the season to help you use up everything that you grew.
Garden resource page on our website has a list of what to grow, and it even talks about if you should transplant it or grow it for seed, and it's really specific to Summit County. It's been grown by gardeners, so we just keep adding it to the list. So it's on our website. You can definitely download that. We also have a beginning vegetable gardener's tip handout that just kind of goes through some of these basic things, more basic than this, like what you have to do if you transplant, why go from seed versus transplanting, and then talking about mulches, because I highly recommend mulches if you can get a hold of them, just because the sun is so, in the wind, even in Brack, is so, like, piercing, whatever is the word, and everything just dries out really fast, and if you're going from seed, you're going to have to water every day. So if you can get a mulch on hand, and I know that a lot of the soil we're using is actually a half-inch mulch in it, so when it rains, the soil drops and the mulch comes to the top. So we do have some mulch in the gardens. However, if you can get a hold of straw, and I would suggest weed-free straw, and I understand that straw
Not hay.
Is hay does not have the hay seeds or the sprouts, so do not get hay, but it's straw that you want. That worked really well for my garden. I've also seen people use grass, as long as it's not treated.
Coconut husks if you're a millionaire.
Yeah. Someone used rabbit shavings that were not used. So there's a lot, and some people say even compost alone, so we're going to amend with compost will help with some of that, but if you can get a hold of mulch, it'll help a lot with your water.
Thoughts, questions, things that you guys want to share with each other? Or?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So last year I grew radishes and carrots, and my first crops grew really well, and then the second and third plantings just didn't really grow. I didn't know if it got too warm for them, or if you had any tips.
It could definitely have gotten too warm for them for your second and third planting. If you also plant them in the same spot every time, they're going to use up the nutrients in the first cycle, and then there isn't going to be as much left for the second and third cycle. So that's why I recommend, moving it around a little bit, even if you're able to move them an inch to the side and just move the whole thing over a little bit every once in a while. You're able to get more bang for your buck from the compost. You can also make small amendments throughout the season. A little bit of compost tea works really well to help with your watering. So compost tea, sifting water through compost, whether you have a worm composter at home or just some compost, let it sit with some water. take the solids off of it, and it's going to be like brown looking water. Cut that half and half with regular water and then just water with that. It's sort of a really diluted nutrient that, since it's water-based, it's going to seep through a lot quicker than a decomposing piece of birch bark would.
How big do we expect carrots to get up here? Because I kept waiting for my carrots to grow last year. Maybe I just had my expectations weren't very realistic.
No, carrots, actually, because they're a root crop, they do well in the shoulder season, so springtime and fall. And actually, carrots are something that gets sweeter with a frost. So if you plant them later in the season, if you still have a couple left in the ground, you can insulate them with straw, and you can harvest carrots throughout the winter time. Especially if you're doing that at home, that's a good thing to do. You can cover them with straw or even a piece of plastic to get the snow off, and you can go out and grab your carrots. And that's where the really sweet carrots come from, or after they're frosted, they produce more sucrose.
There's two reasons that your carrots did poorly. You either put the seed in too far into the soil, or you put them too close together. They need like 2 inches
I did
minimum.
keep thinning them. I'll know that.
I would say people don't thin enough.
Yeah,
2 inches,
it was kind
like
of painful.
yeah.
It is painful. to
Kelly and
thin.
I do. So
Get
yeah,
it, babies.
you pull them out, you're like ah, but you gotta do it just for the sake of getting carrots. But I've had people in Frisco. I have a girl who has a plot like at her house, and she had a carrot this big. So it is possible. They just need a lot of time. You need to get the seeds in, and you need to make sure you're not putting them in too deep. They have the smallest seeds ever, and people want to dig a hole. And they really only need a little bit of dusting on top, and then they start establishing themselves.
Yeah, most of the time when you're planting too, you can measure something out on your finger, and it's either like a first knuckle planter, a second knuckle planter, or a third knuckle planter. And then you don't need a ruler, you don't need a shovel. It's just, put the seed on the end of your finger and jam it in however far you need it to be and push it over. Most seeds don't need to go farther than the third knuckle.
How long are, I was gonna say, are seeds good for, like if I have seeds from last year?
You start to lose germination rate year after year. You lose a certain percentage in that first year, and then it sort of goes exponentially after that. I would recommend after 3-4 years throwing them out, or throw them in your compost pile, release them free into the wild, because they're probably not going to germinate at a high enough rate that you would be happy with them. They might, every once in a while, but their endoplasm starts to go bad, and then they're not viable anymore. But that's why a seed swap might be really cool to do in the fall. If you guys have extra seeds, you can bring them, and we can all swap them around and see who wants to trade. And it could be a fun thing to do with saved seeds also.
I'm gonna do potatoes this year, and I haven't done those before in the container at the house. Can you just touch on those?
Yeah, so potatoes, my favorite way to do potatoes is in tires. You start with 2 tires and your potato eyes in there, so that's the cut up pieces of potato with the one eye sticking out on it. That's basically the start of the potato plant. You only want 1 eye per chunk. You put those in and you keep burying them. They love to be buried. And as you're burying them up, you put another tire on and you bury them some more. You put another tire on, you bury them some more, until the leaves and the stems die off. And then you take off your tires, you push them over, and all the dirt falls out and all your potatoes fall out. That is my favorite way to do potatoes.
How deep do you go, like 3 or 4?
I've gone 3 or 4, sometimes even 5. It depends on how long the season is. Up here, probably 3 or 4.
We had a potato condo made, which is kind of cool. It's the same concept out of wood, and you just add like a side to it, and the kids were loving it. I could not believe we started so late, and they got tons of potatoes out of it.
Yeah,
so they're really easy. In Sylvanas, they have a potato patch. They're really easy to grow up here.
Our potatoes got mushy. Do you know what causes that?
Mushy, that's a lot of times because of any kind of like vermin or bugs that will get in there. It'll cause it to get mushy and sort of fall apart. Also, if you wait too long to harvest, they'll start to decompose. So you want to make sure you watch them at the end of the season to make sure that they're not falling apart. Potato beetles are something that attack the leaves. If the leaves die before the potato matures, a lot of times that can make them squishy and yucky. Potato beetles are big, nasty, ugly guys. Like, you can pick them off and like put them on a shish kebab. They're big. But the little bugs are harder to control. So a lot of times having those spicy things like mustards and stuff planted near them can help deter. If you have nematodes or anything like that, there's a variety of different pests that can get in there. Try a different location. That's why the potato tires are really nice, because you can put them in a different place if they're not working so well from year to year.
Yeah, we didn't cut ours up though. I didn't like that.
Okay, so if you buy potato starts, a lot of times they're already cut up for you, but you can get a whole potato and you can cut out the eye. Usually you want 1 inch by 1 inch, or a decent chunk with one eye on it, because that one eye is going to be the green that goes up. And it's pretty cool. It doesn't matter which way you put the eye, it always finds its way up. I don't know how it does that. So you want to make sure only one eye. If you have more than one eye, it's going to cause competition with your stems going up.
Can you use potatoes from the grocery store, or will they not be good cultivars?
They're probably not going to be as good to start off with. You can get good potatoes to start with from the farmer's market. You can order potato starts online, but my favorite way is if you keep your potatoes in a cool, dry place, basement or anything like that, you can use your own potatoes from year to year, and those are like the easiest seeds to save are potatoes, because you just save a potato.
I know you can get a bag of potatoes, a mesh bag from Summit Landscaping and also from Alpine Gardens. Right now they have purple, Yukon, and another one. That's what I usually buy, and she's right, they come in whole potatoes and you cut them up and you'll have like more potatoes than you can ever imagine.
And the potatoes from them will grow all right up here?
And purple potatoes are
early
awesome.
and they need lots of sun, because I tried growing them on my porch and didn't realize they were getting shade part of the day, and I had to use potatoes.
Okay.
So, but everybody, I know some people that have done huge potatoes
Cool.
and they do really well here.
Awesome.
Purple potatoes make purple mashed potatoes.
I love the purple potatoes.
Any other questions, potatoes or otherwise?
Have you heard of anybody growing quinoa up here?
I actually have in Breckenridge. There's a girl, kind of
Successfully.
Holly's been, demonstrating that she's grown. I could probably get her
Holly from
information.
CNC?
Holly Bleak? No.
That would be awesome.
She started practicing with a local. She's trying to make seed out of it to have like a local.
Yeah, I haven't had a lot of luck with quinoa, and I know that when you are growing quinoa, you need a lot more space to get enough quinoa for a bowl of quinoa. You might get one bowl of quinoa the whole season.
She has an area she's practicing, and it was 2 years ago. I don't know how well it's gone, but I did hear she was doing it.
Well, I think that's probably about it. Thank you so much for coming, guys. I really appreciate it. You guys were awesome in sharing your experiences.